first of all, thank you for the opportunity to comment on Common Core's English Language Arts standards. I was, among other things, the Senior Associate Commissioner in the Department of Education in Massachusetts, and rightly, or whether people, in any event, I was the person responsible for the development of all of our K-12 standards in all major subjects, as well as teacher licensure tests and teacher licensing regulations. And some of you may remember me from about 1.5 years ago when I testified in Madison on the reading licensure test that I had developed in Massachusetts. That is considered one of the reasons for the strengthening of the teacher corps that was fundamental in my own view and philosophy for teaching to the very high standards that Massachusetts developed. Together, these help to propel base 8 students to first place on our National Assessment of Educational Progress test, grade 4, grade 8, reading and math, as well as first place in grade 8 on an international science test. I have also been on the validation committee for Common Core, and I will make a few remarks about my experiences on the validation committee. I have also been a member of the State Board of Education in Massachusetts from 2006 to 2010. So I was a professional person in the Department of Education working on standards, because I have also been in a very early life a teacher at the elementary and the high school level, and I was a citizen appointment on a State Board of Education at the time that Common Core was being developed, and I was on Common Core's validation committee, which was charged with validating the standards or ensuring a number of things that I will comment on. And I have testimony that I have made available, and a few pages that I will bounce off of the outline will indicate my major points, but I also have 40 pages in addition that will be posted and available on various places, including my homepage at the University of Arkansas, where for 5.5 years I was a professor of education reform until this past December, when I retired from the University of Arkansas back to Brookline. In any event, these 40 pages give my individual comments on a lot of the standards in Common Core. I don't think many people will want to go through them all, but they can glance at how we look at standards from a Massachusetts perspective, because the same perspective that informed the way I look at most of these reading and vocabulary standards in Common Core informed what we did in Massachusetts to produce a document that was very much supported by the teachers, particularly the English teachers in the state of Massachusetts. Let me begin first with some comments on the validation committee. It was one of the committees set up by the two groups that together sponsored the development of Common Core standards, the National Government Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. They regularly claimed that Common Core standards emerged from a, quote, state-led process, end quotes, in which experts and educators were well represented. But from our perspective and from my own individual perspective, the people who wrote Common Core standards, and we know who they were, their specific names attached, did not represent the relevant stakeholders, nor were they qualified to draft these standards that would transform instruction for every child, according to CCSSI, the name of the project itself. The validation committee was created after the Standards Development Committee created the first college readiness standards. And I'm going to read a few of those so that you can understand what those college readiness standards were. And the name itself is very important to note, because this is the first time we have ever had in this country and in any state a set of standards for K-12 that are called college readiness standards. Most states have developed, if they've developed standards, all states have developed standards that would determine the competencies for a high school diploma. They never developed standards that would automatically serve to propel students towards college, because not all students go to college. Not all students want to go to college. And so what high schools have had are varying kinds of courses for different kinds of student needs and interests. The validation committee was created in the middle of 2009 to put the seal of approval on the drafters' work. But the committee itself was useless, if not misleading. It had about 29 members, and we had a membership that consisted primarily of people associated with the testing industry or with schools of education. We had exactly 2 content experts. I was the one for the English language arts standards, and we had 1 mathematician. I want you to understand that this was a validation committee. It was supposed to make sure that the standards that came out of this process were, 1, internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. They would make us competitive with other countries, leading countries' standards. The people who were missing on this committee and who were missing on the standards development committee were high school math and English teachers and English scholars. They were nowhere to be seen on the standards development committee or on the validation committee. This was the validation committee. You have to understand that there were obviously certain ideas about what Common Core was designed to get at by the time it finished coming up with the standards that would determine college readiness, that students could enter a community level college and have guaranteed for them, if they passed a test based on these college readiness standards, would have guaranteed for them credit-bearing freshman courses. That was the basic idea for college readiness standards, that they would supposedly ensure that students were college ready. And the irony was that the 2 groups who would normally get together in almost any common sense view of the situation, those who teach college freshmen, math or English, and high school teachers of math or English, were for the most part not on any of these committees. That was the basic problem that started the Common Core. And the problem was then immediately compounded. The validation committee served from 2009 to 2010, and in May 2010, we were, 25 to 29 of us on the committee, asked to sign off on the criteria we were given, which included benchmarking, transparent process, and research-based, a number of other criteria. And the 2 of us who were the content experts, plus 3 other people, did not sign off. All the others did sign off, but the only people who were content experts did not sign off on these standards that had been released in June of 2010. So we were asked to sign off before the final version ever came out. And within 30 to 60 days, a little bit more for a few states, almost 45 state boards of education approved these standards without the usual process that they had all gone through, if they had state standards, of a year to 2 years of public process, deliberation, hearing from the various interest groups, as we did in Massachusetts. All of this happened very rapidly, including the state of Massachusetts, where I was on the State Board of Education. We voted in July, and people have always said, how did Massachusetts, with the best sets of standards in the country, vote for Common Core? Answer is very simple: $250 million of Race to the Top money, which was promised to the state if we adopted Common Core right away. Our commissioner was caught between a rock and a hard place. How could you give up $250 million? And that was, as everyone knows, the carrot for enticing all states, starting in January 2010, So we have what I would call an invalid validation committee with standards that were not developed by those people who are experts in the two disciplines that we have these so-called college-ready standards in. And I will first now give you some general comments on their weaknesses, because this is what you now have. But I would like to make it clear, in light of some of the conversation I heard earlier, make it clear that you do need to understand that Common Core standards cannot be changed. They are copyrighted. They are copyrighted to the two organizations that produce them. And if you go to the home page of Common Core standards, you will see the copyright on the bottom page. Those of you who have laptops can go to it and see and read that indeed the standards, when they are adopted, must be adopted as a whole. Not one word can be changed in them. So, and I just finished testifying about this in Florida yesterday. There is no way any state that has adopted these standards can change a word of those standards. You can add another 15% if you wish, but you cannot change, because that is the point behind having common standards and then common tests based on those common standards. I will get to the tests in a minute, but you have to understand from a logical common sense point of view, you can't have common standards if every state can change those standards. So what they have, they're stuck with. And there is no process for revision built in whatsoever. Nobody knows at this point how these standards can ever be changed. No process has been set forth by the two groups that sponsored them. No one else, Congress supposedly can't even get into the act because this was a state-led venture, and there are some constitutional restrictions on Congress doing anything in this area to begin with. The USED is still nevertheless getting into the act in different ways, and I understand later this month, maybe next week in Chicago, Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, is talking about the need to support Common Core standards. Now, if this is a state-led venture, the question is, what is the Secretary of Education getting himself involved? He has also established a technical review committee that will look at the test items being developed by the testing consortia that the federal government has funded to develop test items to assess these standards, Common Core standards. So the whole question of whose standards they are and the role of the federal government is pretty clear in fact, even if in principle they are not supposed to be federal or national standards. Supposedly they are state standards, but the states can't do a thing to them. Not like their own state standards, which they could revise according to whatever the statute required. Let's take a look at some of the problems in these standards that you have and that are going to be there regardless of whatever kinds of guidance your very hard-working Department of Education tries to provide as materials and resources to your teachers. First of all, most of Common Core's standards are content-free skills. They contain no guidelines for the most part. There are only a few standards that do, and I'll read off one or two of them. I happen to put them in there because I was asked to contribute them, so I know what they are by heart. But most of them are content-free skills. Skills such as, and I'm going to read one that I don't particularly like to read, but it probably gives a good example of the problem that is faced by both assessors, makes it easier for them in a sense, they have nothing much to stick to, and teachers. Analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of the text. I'll read it again. Analyze, this is a reading standard. This is one of the anchor reading standards. Analyze how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of the text. No one really understands what that means, so for the next 12 grades, we get supposedly greater specificity of what that standard means at grade level. Let me read you the 12th grade level version of that anchor standard, just so you get a sense of the writing quality of the standards. This is the grade level 11 and 12 version of that anchor standard. Analyze a complex set of ideas or sequence of events and explain how specific individuals' ideas or events interact and develop over the course of the text. Is that clear? I don't mean to be sarcastic, but it's one of the things that I fought against and made sure that when in Massachusetts we wrote standards, they had to be clear to ordinary people, they had to be clear to teachers, and people had to know what they meant simply by being able to read well-written English prose. So we have content-free skills that in some cases are not easily interpretable and will be interpreted by test developers in only ways that they may understand. Whether they will be the same across all test developers remains to be seen. This is a work in progress. We don't know. We haven't seen the final results. We don't even know where the cut scores are going to be on these tests that are being developed for college readiness. But that is something that needs to be kept in mind. That is why it's very difficult to answer some questions about what do these standards really mean in the classroom when we don't know what the tests look like yet or where the cut score is. The second issue I want to raise is a very serious one in the English language arts. The Common Core standards stress writing more than reading at every grade level to the detriment of every subject in the curriculum. This I did not realize until I began to count up the standards. At almost every grade level, there are more writing than reading standards. Now, some of you may say, so what? It so happens that this is the opposite of what an academically sound reading English curriculum should be like. This is the opposite of what research says for 100 years. It's the opposite of what anyone who writes well knows. All good writers have been good readers. You can become a good writer if you are a good reader, but reading is the central subject that must be taught. And for some unknown reason, known only to the writers of the English language arts standards, they decided to make writing occupy more time than reading in the school curriculum. What teachers actually do may differ, but this is at least what the standards are calling for. The foundation for good writing is good reading. Yes, you need to do some writing, I'm not saying that, but every school knows that for all children, there must be more emphasis on reading if we are to ever get subject area comprehension as well as good writing. Third point, Common Core standards, writing standards, are developmentally inappropriate at many grade levels. I won't go into the details here because they're in my paper, but there are arguments by people, child development experts at the K2 level who have been horrified is too strong a word, but it's one that some of them have used, at what is being expected in K2. There are other kinds of issues, claims. Students in the middle grades are being asked to set forth a claim. Many of these children only know about baggage claims. They do not know what a rhetorical claim in a piece of writing is. And it's not easy for many children who are poor readers to understand what a claim is in order to set forth a claim in a piece of writing based on some issue. It might not even be a piece of writing that they've had to read before. 4, and this gets at a little bit of what we've also discussed earlier, Common Core expects English teachers to spend at least half of their reading instructional time at every grade level on informational texts. Why is this the case? Because Common Core consists of 10 reading informational standards at every grade level and 9 literature standards at every grade level from K to 10. So I call it the 50-50 mandate, but there's actually more instructional reading supposed to be taking place in an English class. Now, why is this a problem? It is a problem because information is not what English teachers have been trained to teach, have never been trained to teach, and it is not something that is taught in an English class. Scientific information is taught in a science class, history information is taught in a history class, but in any event, we have 10 and 9 reading standards at every grade level. The 3070 refers to something else, and I won't even get into that because it is very confusing because the writers of these standards didn't understand what they were doing when they took the 3070 from NAEP reading assessment frameworks developed in 2003. I was on the committee, so I understand where they got the chart from, but the 70-30 across the curriculum division of literary versus informational reading comes from NAEP's own attempts to set what percentages it thinks should be for the passages on NAEP reading tests. They explicitly say it has nothing to do with the English curriculum or the high school curriculum. But the people who wrote the English language arts standards for Common Core apparently did not do very close reading of that document. That's another piece of sarcasm because they really mucked that up. So we have a half and half. Now what does that mean in practice? That is really a way to insert some control over the curriculum. Even though Common Core claims it's only a set of standards, if you are attempting to have 50% reading instruction on something called information and another 50% on something called literature, you have diminished the amount of literary study in K through 12. That is what is happening in many states. Your own State Department of Ed may not be in any way suggesting that as a guideline, but other state departments of ed are pretty clear that there will be no more than 50-50. Literary study is 50% of the English class. Now, what does that mean in practice from the few teachers I've been able to speak to in other states? It means they sometimes have to teach excerpts, not whole literary works, because they can't fit long novels or long epic poems into that 50%. It all depends on what is used at the local level and what guidelines come through from a State Department of Education. But there is another more important and serious consequence of the reduction of literary study, and that is it reduces opportunities for students to develop critical thinking. One of the concepts or ideas that I've talked to a number of people about is where does critical thinking get developed in a K through 12 curriculum? It typically gets developed when English teachers help students to learn how to read between the lines. That's where we learn how to do analytical reading of something that may seem deceptively simple on the surface. The body of information you bring to your critical thinking can come from any of the other subjects, but typically your history textbooks, your math textbooks, your science textbooks are informational textbooks. They want to teach information. They don't want to trick kids. They don't want to be written in a very ambiguous way. They want kids to understand what information they're presenting. But the English teacher who teaches, for example, the simple Wordsworth poem, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky," and you get to the line towards the end of that very short poem that says, "The child is father to the man." That's like red meat for English teachers. They can spend an hour helping kids understand how do you interpret that one line. It's a wonderful little poem, but that is the sort of thing done on a larger scale by English teachers to help students learn to develop critical thinking or learning how to read between the lines of something so that you figure out what something means by looking at what the rest of the stuff is there, the text, and other things that you may bring to that particular piece. So reducing literary study will have a serious effect. It will reduce the level of thinking that students in general develop, depending upon what a teacher does behind closed doors. I have, as I've mentioned, done, and I'm going to go through this much faster now, analyzed a lot of standards. My conclusion from going through these particular standards, vocabulary and reading, which are going to be posted or handed out, are several. First of all, Common Core standards are not fewer, clearer, and deeper. This is one of the great problems. one of many claims made of these standards which have never been piloted or tested anywhere. The reason Common Core standards often appear to be fewer in number, I realized as I went through these again, is because very different objectives or activities are often bundled incoherently into one standard. If you want to have fewer standards and you've got 10 things you want students to do, you just put them all into one standard. That doesn't make the standards clearer or deeper. It really makes them almost uninterpretable, unfortunately. You end up with fewer standards, but you have pushed an awful lot of stuff into what they are calling one standard. Many of them are very poorly written, and the example I gave you at first was intended to show you a very poorly written standard. They needed to have been revised by experienced, well-trained high school English teachers, such as the one I had many years ago, and I'm sure you have many like that right now in Wisconsin, but they were nowhere to be seen among the standards writers. They needed to be revised for clarity and for readability before they are used to guide curriculum development anywhere, but we have no idea of when they could ever possibly be revised because they are copyrighted by organizations that have announced no process for inviting revision. Vocabulary standards are particularly weak, and yet they should be the strongest because if reading comprehension depends on anything, it depends on advancing students' knowledge of the meaning of words. And some of the advice that comes with these standards, there is pedagogy in there, is a real disservice to children who need strong vocabulary development. So let me start off with a few conclusions. Common Core standards are not rigorous. That's why you hear the word rigorous used all the time. It's repeated often, simply to help people think that maybe they are rigorous, but no one's been able to point to anything that's rigorous in them. They were basically designed to allow mid-level grade 11 students to enroll in credit-bearing courses in a non-selective college. And we have quotes from the math standards writers exactly to that point. That will be mentioned at another hearing, I believe. They are not internationally benchmarked. For 4 years I've been asking for the names of the countries and I've never gotten them. There is no research to support their stress on writing over reading, no research to support their stress on informational reading instead of literary study, and certainly no research to support the value of, quotes, cold reading of historical documents, which is, again, a bizarre kind of pedagogy promoted by the chief architect of Common Core standards. He actually has a videotape of his attempt to show English teachers how to teach the Gettysburg Address devoid of historical context. How anyone would want anyone, history or English teacher, to teach the Gettysburg Address without understanding who said it, when, where, at what point in the Civil War, what was Lincoln trying to accomplish. But this is supposed to, quote, level the playing field. In other words, equally ignorant children approach a text, and therefore we have leveled the playing field. It's available on the web. So, recommendations very quickly. I would recommend that Wisconsin can certainly do much better than it is doing with what its Board of Ed adopted in 2010 without asking, so far as I know, its own higher ed faculty in math, science, engineering, literary study to look at the college readiness standards and to tell the Board of Ed if these standards met their ideas of college readiness. Why would you expect bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to decide your college admissions requirements? Why didn't you ask your own higher ed experts what they thought, since they're the ones that are going to have to adjust the content of those credit-bearing freshman courses? There are plenty of standards you could have looked at. Massachusetts has been mentioned. I know those almost by heart because they were done under my direction. But California is a first class, Indiana is a first class. So there are very many different sets of standards out there that could be looked at that are far superior in all different kinds of ways, which may come up in some of the questions and answers. to what Common Core is offering you. You could have entrance exams called matriculation exams tailored to your own institutions of higher education. You have many in this state that are first class. Ask your professors at those universities to decide what they would want to see Wisconsin high school students know in English and in math and in science for admission to your own universities and engineering colleges. To me, that's common sense. Although my own Board of Education in Massachusetts didn't want to do it either. And you certainly wouldn't want state assessments that are based on or aligned to Common Core standards, because it would be a waste of money to base state assessments on standards that need to be completely revised, if not abandoned. So now you have heard my jaunty
I was a teacher, I can give the evil eye. Okay, please refrain from doing that. Besides the fact, if I want to give these first few their due time, but we have a lot of speakers who want to go, and we might be here till Thanksgiving. So we need to make sure we aren't costing time with applause and things like that. So please, let's table that. Thank you, Dr. Stotsky. There are some who have questions, but just a couple things quickly. As the afternoon has worn on, school has let out, people are getting out of work, and we have people sitting down in the back, which is fine if you're comfortable doing that, but there are seats available if you wander down the aisle and take a look. We encourage you to check that out. For those of you who are just arriving, once again, there are restrooms across the hallway to the door on my left in the back of the room if you need them. And we will start with questions from Senator Buchner was first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, thank you, Dr. Stotsky. I have long admired your work. In fact, going back 20 years ago when I was teaching my daughter to read. So I thank you for all that you have done, and you are very articulate and very passionate about educating children and how to educate children and what to teach them as well. You have said some very, I think, striking things that many people have been concerned about when we look at the Common Core standards, but given your level of expertise, you have been able to articulate it in a way that most other people cannot. Things that I heard you say that are alarming to me. That this was an invalid validation process to create the standards. The standards weren't developed by experts. The two content experts, you being one of them, you didn't sign off on the standards. The standards were approved by most or 30-some states within 30 to 60 days. They can't be changed. They're copyrighted. They're content-free skills, even though we've been told that this is the first time we're having very content-specific standards. They're not easy to understand. They will be interpreted by test developers, and that could be very ambiguous depending on the test developer. They stress writing versus over reading, which is the opposite of 100 years of research, you said. They're developmentally inappropriate at many levels. And there's pedagogy within the standards, even though we were just told a little while ago there is no pedagogy in the standards. Why in the world would the states across this nation go down this path? How has this happened, in your opinion? You've given some suggestions as to what can be done. I would like you to not only respond to those two questions, but also mention what, you said you testified in Florida, and Governor Scott is walking away from the standards. What steps are they taking in Florida as well? And that's my first round.
They are not sure what step they're taking yet because they're still reading the tea leaves. But there were, the meeting I testified at yesterday was one of the 3 meetings that the Department of Education has set up based upon what Governor Scott last week asked for, more possibilities for parents and others who are growing in numbers and very concerned. And it's not just public school parents, it's homeschooling parents and parents with kids in private schools. So that was the opportunity for them, and this was the first of 3 meetings. And that was what I was testifying at yesterday for them. But what he's doing is simply at this point gathering more information to find out basically how much consternation and concern there is out there among parents, because that was the major group left out of the whole process from beginning to end. It's as if policymakers knew what's good for other people's children, but parents didn't even know anything about Common Core until they began to see the lessons starting to take place in their children's classrooms this past year. That's why parents are now becoming more concerned. They didn't know anything about it. Many local school boards knew nothing about it. State legislators knew nothing about it until this past year when some bills became obvious. You know, they got to pay for the high technology. This was you're asking a very important question that I often think about. How did 45 plus state boards of education not ask basic questions about what does college readiness mean? What is your definition of college readiness? And take a look at these standards. Part of the problem is very few people know how to read a set of math standards. That's number one. I can't read a set of math standards myself. I would have to ask a mathematician to tell me what those high school standards are. The fact that there are no standards for pre-calculus in this document is something I could not have picked up. Most teachers could not have picked up unless they teach pre-calculus at the high school level. But if you have no high school math teachers on these standards development committees, how can you find out that something's missing in the document? They never intended to have pre-calculus or a full course of trig available. So if you have people who didn't call on experts who they should have called on, that's part of it. But I don't want to take up a lot of time because there may be questions.
One more follow-up. Part of the reason in Wisconsin is we don't have a board of education. So that's one of the reasons you may not be aware of the fact that Wisconsin does not. So our state superintendent of public instruction unilaterally made a decision to go down this road. And that's why we are now trying to catch up to get input from parents and from lawmakers. So how do we answer the local control question? Because if a state develops the Common Core standards, and we keep hearing, we heard at the last hearing from so many of the educators that we still have our local control. We still have our local control. And I guess I'm wondering how you have local control when there are 2 consortia that have created a test that will be used in the states. And I've always heard that tests drive the curriculum. So where is the local control when a state adopts the Common Core?
There is some element of local control in terms of specific text that might be chosen in an English class, as we heard earlier. The levels of complexity argument, I really don't want to spend a lot of time on, but those are examples and they can be drawn on, but teachers can choose almost anything. However, all the publishers are rushing to put a stamp on their materials aligned with Common Core. They may or may not be aligned with Common Core, it doesn't matter. They're just putting a stamp on. This has happened within the past 3 years. Almost everything out there is aligned with Common Core. Literature anthologies are now coming out aligned with Common Core. So there's about 50% informational stuff, 50% literary stuff. Now, what happens behind a closed door, we don't know. But that's local control. Local school board, I don't know what they have as responsibilities anymore. Basically, their responsibilities have been taken away by the decision to adopt Common Core in most of these states.
Thank you.
Senator Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for covering such a distance with your testimony. I have a couple different questions. My first one really centers around how well you know Wisconsin. I listened to your testimony. I'm not sure you know what's going on here. We have had the Wisconsin Council of Teachers of English very much in favor of Common Core standards. We've had a university group called the Math Common Competencies Group that's looked at Common Core standards and provided input, it's my understanding, to that. So the allegation that this whole process has been one that's free of regular teachers, which, I agree with you. You need to have regular teachers both at the high school, university level, all levels involved in this. I'm not sure that you take that into consideration. I'm just wondering, for example, have you looked at our model standards, 1998, and the standards we have now? Can you make a comparison for Wisconsin?
I did review your original standards for Fordham Institute. I used to be their regular reviewer of all state standards. And I agree with the comments that some people have made. Maybe all people share this view that your original standards in English language arts, let me put it that way because that's my area of expertise, I wouldn't want to comment on others, were not very good. So you do need better standards. That's why I'm not recommending you return, which I could say in Florida. They had better standards in Common Core and they abandoned them. But Wisconsin does not have better standards in terms of its old standards. It needs to have a process in which there is a better sense of what a standard is and what the actual subject areas within English are. But that's a whole other conversation on what to do to develop better standards. As far as some of these groups now coming out and endorsing, this is a serious issue, and I agree that it can be confusing to the public. One of our major problems is the lack of independence that most teachers and many others have in being able to criticize Common Core. They are afraid to say anything negative in public to identify themselves. Yesterday, as I said, I was in Florida, and there were, after my testimony and someone on math standards, about 35 educators who got up praising Common Core. There was only one person from an educational group criticizing, and that was a retired teacher. There is a serious issue in the way teachers are going to be evaluated that I am discovering everywhere. And reporters tell me the same thing. They cannot find critical teachers' voices who can be identified to give them quotes for their articles. In Arkansas, there was one English teacher in the entire state who was willing to be identified. She had tenure. But there are things that can be done even to a tenured teacher in a school. It is a very, very serious issue. So when the English Teachers Organization, NCTE, of which I am a member, endorses, there's an element of politics in it. And unfortunately, this is mainly what the issues are. They're political, they're not educational. Teacher organizations want to be able to sit at the table. Some of them want to be able to continue getting access to grants. And teachers at the classroom level do not want to be identified as being, quote, unprofessional, which is one of the terms that's being used if you are critical of Common Core, which is the state policy, which has become the state policy. So you have groups and even teachers, English teachers, who used to be very outspoken about many things in the English curriculum, who won't say a word, for the most part, about the problems they're facing. That's why parents are now the major group coming up, because they're not afraid to talk about what's happening to their children. They're willing to talk because there's no retribution that can be done against a parent. Now, the professional groups are a different story. I think one would need to find out, first of all, if the math teaching faculty were the ones that looked at, and since I haven't seen these documents, I can't comment, I'm just raising a question. Did the math, engineering, and science faculty who teach freshman courses look at those standards? Did they not notice that there's no pre-calculus? Did they not notice that there's not a full course in trig? In engineering colleges, and you have them in Wisconsin, you begin with Calculus 1. There is no way to get to Calculus 1 in Common Core. And that is why the college boards, a few weeks ago, said that they were dropping the AP Calculus test and syllabus because they said it's not part of the Common Core sequence. So I would need to explore what people at higher ed have looked at those standards Because I'm relying upon this mathematician, James Milgram from Stanford, who says the standards aren't there. You can't get, they don't prepare high school students for STEM. That was what we thought was going to be one of the goals of Common Core. But here's a mathematician saying they don't prepare high school students for STEM. So how could this group that you may believe has looked at these standards agree that they are suitable for their universities? What are we talking about? I can't tell you.
Thank you. The other question I have has to do with Massachusetts and mathematics. You know, a lot of people in this audience are very strongly in favor of local control. It's my understanding that in Massachusetts, you use PEARLS, you use TIMS, and standards and testing, internationally benchmarked, developed by 48 nations, not developed locally in Massachusetts.
You mean our mathematics standards?
Yes.
They were developed with the help of a mathematics professor at Harvard University. He helped us, but we got input from others to determine what the content of Algebra 1 should be. My feeling was that if one Harvard professor couldn't tell us what the content of Algebra 1 was, we were sunk as a nation. But that's different. But the point is that the standards specify the content of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, pre-calculus, and geometry. What textbook is used is at the local level. And there are and have been a variety of textbooks that can be used. Some are better than others, but that's a mathematical judgment that I'm not qualified to enter into. People with mathematical knowledge and training, math majors, can do that.
And the testing that's used in Massachusetts is international test?
No, we have our own state tests, and they were based on our state standards, but they're vetted by people with mathematical knowledge at the university level.
My final question, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that in a Pioneer white paper that you wrote about STEM, and that the idea is to move that math down, that Algebra 1 should be for everybody, move it down. Is that correct?
No, that is not what is in the document. What we offered, and this was approved by David Driscoll, who was the Commissioner of Education, or Superintendent of Education, what we offered were integrated standards for 7 and 8, and we also offered a full set of Algebra 1 standards, but we did not say at what grade level they should be taught. Over 50% of Massachusetts high school students now take a full Algebra 1 course in grade 8, but that is their choice. And they have to prepare the students for it if they expect students to effectively pass the course. But we didn't provide any tests for Algebra 1. We provide a general, more or less arithmetic test for the integrated 7-8 standards. But the school systems can choose what courses in mathematics they want to teach. In Massachusetts, as in Wisconsin, there are many mathematically sophisticated people. They're not all mathematicians, but they're engineers or scientists or others. And they know how to look at the standards and judge what they think would be suitable. So school systems, many of them, have a lot of pressure to make sure that the coursework they offer will prepare students for the kinds of colleges they want their kids to go to, like MIT or CIT and so on. So that's why the courses are there, but they're not mandated by the set of standards. All that's there in the standards are the topics that should be covered for a full course, say, in pre-calculus. It's up to the school to decide what it does with it.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, I've listened to your whole testimony. I can't exactly see what you're advocating in terms of standards. Would you think it would be good for Wisconsin to be like Massachusetts? Is that to use your language arts standards and the way it's done in Massachusetts? I understand, I disagree with you that Massachusetts would make a decision to go for race to the top only based on Common Core standards. That was a factor, I know, at the time, but I think that's arguable. But my question is, what are you advocating? What do you want to see us do in terms of Common Core standards? Throw the whole thing out and be like Massachusetts?
No, I didn't say you should be like Massachusetts. I just said before that I would recommend you construct a first-class set of standards You could draw on those in California, Massachusetts, and Indiana. I mentioned 3 states. So you could develop your own first-class set of standards, but you have to look at the way real standards look. These are standards that are acknowledged by other people to be real standards. And in Massachusetts, at least, there seems to be indirectly empirical evidence that they're good. Because we can say that, at least we can see from the student scores, from the tests based on these standards, that our students are benefiting. And it shows up on an international test that we have no control over as well, for the science and math standards as well. But what I'm not saying that you want to become like any other state. What you want are first-class standards, and you don't have them in Common Core. That's all I'm saying, that you need to develop standards in English and in math, and you will hear much more about math from people who know mathematics, that are first class, because there are serious limitations in the standards you now have that affect what teachers can do, what the tests are going to do and show, so far as we can see, because we don't see the tests yet. You know where the cut scores are. We know where they are in Massachusetts.
Before we go to our next questioner, I just wanted to acknowledge, he's not on the committee, but he is here. Senator Gudex is in the back. Wave, Senator. Any of you have any questions for the Senator? He'd be happy to listen to you, I'm sure.
Hi, Senator.
Next question's from Representative Knudsen.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Stotsky, for coming back to Wisconsin. I know you believe in state standards. Can I infer from the fact that you were involved in the validation committee that you believed or endorsed in the concept of a common standard for the country at one time, and your objection now is more with it's gone off the rails?
That's fair, because I have always said that I am not a libertarian in philosophy. I do believe in first-class standards. But if we don't have first-class standards, there's no point in having any at all. That was why in Massachusetts we needed first-class standards, or don't bother with them. At the national level, I can see a value to having first-class science and math standards. If they are developed as real academic standards that then give opportunities for local and state input, revision, and there are ways to do it, even in literature. For example, Georgia has a whole grade that is devoted in its older standards to literature, authors, texts that came out of Georgia. Fine, every state could do that. That's part of tailoring to your own state, Wisconsin authors and major texts and so forth. There are ways to do that, but that would be a more detailed explanation than I think we need at this point. But the overarching way to designate, let me give you an example of a Massachusetts standard. It doesn't mean that you become like Massachusetts if you had a standard like this. And this was approved by our English teachers. One of our grade 9-10 standards that's used for determining high school diploma requirements is a standard that asks students in grades 9 or 10 to show that they have some knowledge of the theme and elements of classical, Greek, or Roman epic poetry. Now, this sounds very esoteric, but what we are talking about are works like the Odyssey, the Iliad, or the Aeneid, or works of that period that would be similar. And our English teachers loved this standard. They helped to develop passages on our state tests. By the way, our state tests were developed by our English teachers. So you will find passages from these works, excerpts, on our state test, which shows you a level of reading ability that's needed in order to read that item and do the questions that our very well-trained English teachers, no doubt very similar to those that you have in Wisconsin, who were English majors. And so that is the kind of a standard that doesn't tell the teacher exactly what work to teach. You have a choice, but it guides, and it's only one of many standards. That's not the only standard, obviously, but it helps to make sure that students become educated graduates of an American high school. That's basically what I'm after. If they get a high school diploma, they should be educated citizens of this country. And they should understand the literary and civic heritage of the English language. And I've said this over and over again. So this is in the document. We have an appendix that lists authors, not texts. Authors that indicate our literary and civic heritage. Wisconsin can do its own. I'm sure many of them will be the same, but they may be different ones. And this is what makes students educated.
One more question, and first, and it's about your recommendation. I'm looking at your comments or your testimony from Florida from yesterday, and one of the points was that you recommend review and revision if needed of all state standards every 5 to 7 years. So this is in the theme of something that I've been pursuing through our last hearing and this hearing. I'd like to give you a little Wisconsin context and then ask for your input on that specifically. As you said, states within a few months adopted the Common Core after the final version came out. In some states it was within a few weeks, and some within a few days. In Wisconsin it was within a few hours. We were the first. And I honestly think there wasn't time to read the final version completely before it was adopted. And one of the things that is maybe not unique, but there aren't very many states where there is no state school board. We have a superintendent of public instruction that's a constitutional officer, and I think rightly so. He has interpreted that under his general supervisory powers that he can make suggestions for standards, but they are just suggestions. Our local school boards by state law are required to adopt standards. They may adopt the model state standards if they choose to. And we really only had one model state standard. Back at the whole beginning of the standards movement in 1998, we adopted those standards, and most people can be free to criticize them. Most people have. We've also had a series of assessments called our Wisconsin Knowledge and Concepts exam. It's sort of loosely based on those standards. That's also widely panned as not really a great assessment. So here we were, and sort of recognizing that we need to make change, we adopted Common Core. Part of the reason we're here is that we put in our state budget, right or wrong, could be criticized, but that was how this came about as part of why we're here today, that we shouldn't adopt any further standards, but that by mid-2014, we should have adopted standards based on a process, much like what you call for, where there would be the input of educators and college professors, content experts. Should we go and should that review process happen now based on kind of Common Core as it stands? Do you think that we should then just sort of break away from it and make our improvements here or there? Because this is where we're at right now in Wisconsin, and we've got a test based on Common Core. I know you don't think we should, but we do. And that's I've voted for it twice, and many of the people here have. I mean, that's where we're at. We're on that path. We've essentially adopted Common Core statewide, although every school district could do it differently. None of them have, and I doubt that any of them will, unless the test changes. So here we are. And and then we've also put in, at my request, the idea that we will adopt better standards by mid-2014. I see little chance of that happening. I mean, it would be a year-long process. We would have to have started already. So I think that won't happen. So, and then I come to the question. You recommend 5 to 7 years. Do you think that if we started at 2010 and the clock was running, it's already time to reevaluate by 2015? Would that be a legitimate recommendation of this committee, that we have a total revision process in somewhere between 2015 and 2017, and just stick with Common Core for now?
No.
How do you respond to all of that?
The deeper you dig into Common Core, the more that you implement it, the harder it is to get out of it. That's one of the real problems you have to think about. It will keep costing you more and more. and the costs will continue. And I can't even describe in detail the problem with the teaching of geometry at the high school level, because it's going to be an endless process of professional development, endless. And as teachers turn over in your schools, you're never going to be through with a very expensive professional development process. It's better to cut your losses, in my view, and begin a process of developing better standards. Now, one of the things the legislators have asked about is whether there's a penalty from any money that might have been given to Wisconsin by the federal government. Title I money you're supposed to get. There's supposed to be no conditions attached, so far as we know. So you should be able to get your Title I money. But remember, you're still under No Child Left Behind unless you have a waiver. If you have a waiver, then the question is, what are the conditions of the waiver? And I'm not familiar with the exact details of the contract that was signed for that waiver. One of the possible conditions of a waiver was to get your own institutions of higher ed to agree to having what could be offered as college readiness standards. So that is still possible for Wisconsin to do. It doesn't have to go with Common Core. It could develop its own college readiness standards. You still have to get their input, because college readiness implies that they're going to have to do something with students who are passing a test, determined to be college ready, and end up, if they're accepted at your universities, for a credit-bearing course. So they've got to think about how they're going to respond to that, to whatever level they agree to for your own college readiness level. But that would be, to me, a better way to go at this point is to try, if you have a waiver, maybe redo the waiver. If it's that part that simply says you're going to be part of a Common Core consortium for testing purposes, and develop your own standards that you're satisfied with that are better than Common Core. You now have two default versions you don't want, your old standards as well as Common Core. Go for a better set, combine whatever the best stuff out there is, and then develop, with the help of your own university faculty who are on the public payroll, a set of exams that are matriculation exams for your own university higher ed system. There's no reason why any state couldn't do that. And that's one possibility. It's theoretically legal, as far as I understand it. There are no easy way outs. This is part of the problem. But there is something that one has to think about. All of the homeschooling parents, all of the private schools are being dragged into Common Core. And all the independent points of reference are disappearing, because the ACT test has been aligned to Common Core. At least this is what I've been told. The SATs are now being aligned to Common Core. The GEDs have been aligned to Common Core. So how does one find out how one's kids really are doing on an international level unless they take an international test? But most of them don't go beyond grade 8. And PISA, P-I-S-A, I forget the student assessment, whatever it is, Program for International Student Assessment. This is the one that Finland did very well on, and its own mathematicians are very unhappy. They call it a Pyrrhic victory, that Finland got to #1, because they're having a problem in their universities with the level of math knowledge that they think they need. In any event, that's part of what needs to be. You need to have time to review and bring in expert judgment beyond your Department of Education. You need to get the college experts in the disciplines.
Thank you.
Dr. Stotsky, this is a question that I kind of know the answer to, but so I suspect all of us maybe have a bit of a mystery as to what it means. What does it mean to say that something is internationally benchmarked?
It means, as we understood it on the validation committee and earlier in Massachusetts and in California, it means that the set of standards you have at a particular grade level or for a particular subject are comparable to the most demanding or best set of standards out there. And that then involves looking international tests, as TIMSS, or any other tests that might suggest what high-achieving countries are doing. Singapore and Hong Kong have been used as models. They have, by the way, excellent materials for K-6 curriculum materials that mathematicians have judged highly. But it means comparable to, and it's not one standard at a time. This was part of the problem we had with Common Core. They would take one standard, I'm being simplistic, find the main idea. Well, we can find the main idea in Singapore, therefore it's internationally benchmarked. That's not what internationally benchmarked means. You take an entire set of standards for a subject area across several countries, and you look at more than one. But you look at those that seem to be producing high levels of student achievement.
I've been told, and maybe you know the answer to this, that at one time the Common Core website had that terminology and that was internationally benchmarked, and I was told it's not there anymore. So I actually went and looked last night and I found it, that it is not there anymore. It says that it is informed by other top performing countries. What does that mean?
It's the same thing as consulted. Yes, I noticed there's several changes of wording. It evolved over the years. As several of us kept saying, well, where are the countries we're internationally benchmarked to? Informed by can mean, and that's all it does mean, is that they read the documents in 10 countries and maybe put them in the bottom drawer. Consulted with the documents of 10 countries and then put them in the bottom drawer. It does not mean internationally benchmarked to. It's what I would call weasel wording.
I also was very curious about your statements on, I don't know if I'm quoting you accurately, writing over reading in the Common Core standards. I go back to my own educational training 20, 25 years ago, and that seemed to be a big push back at that period of time. And I can remember it was called the Writer's Workshop at the school that I went to. I'm not sure if that was universally used or not, but it was controversial, and it kind of died out after about 5 years or so. And now it seems, would you say that it's kind of being revived again and keep reviving these failed ideas over and over again?
Each locality does different things, so it's hard to make a firm generalization across all communities in a state and across all states. But the writing process burst onto the scene in the late 1960s, early 70s, because I knew who the people were in the field at that time. The problem was it was hitting a real problem. Kids weren't spending enough time learning how to write. But the school day wasn't lengthened, the school year wasn't lengthened, and as time for going through the stages of folks, the writing process, took up more and more time in the school classroom, that meant time had to be taken away from other things. In some cases, it was often the reading class. It could have been other subjects. This might have depended upon the school system. But the writing process never went away. It's just that by the time you got to the high school class, there were so many things that an English teacher had to teach in one period a day, say 5 days a week, as opposed to the elementary teacher in a self-contained classroom, that it had to be diminished unless the high school worked out the composition class, 5 periods a day. Different schools did different things, but the writing process never disappeared. It has consumed a great deal of time, and Common Core wants it to consume even more, so far as I can see by the number of standards. Again, teachers will decide how to use their class time. This is a variable over which there's very little control, except at the building level by supervisors.
Thank you. Representative Schramm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Stotsky, for your testimony today. I've read a lot of your work before this committee. I think everybody in the room will agree that you've got a quite impressive resume, and I am not afraid to admit that I'm quite intimidated because you remind me very much of my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Miller. But I'm not going to be redundant because I think there were a lot of good questions that were asked. But you, in meeting with the school administrators so far in the last few months. You said, there's a time where you have to have this conversation about developing better standards. I'd like you to just go into a little bit more in-depth explanation of the concern that school administrators have right now, that they've been developing these standards for 2 years, and that they're going to, be behind the 8 ball if they don't continue with the standards. Can you just give a little bit of your, your opinion of how important it is, if this is truly about the kids and, about the exceptionalism that we're trying to achieve? Can you, just maybe talk a little bit more about the 2-year period that we've been involved in this, and where if we don't revise and come up with better standards, where we're going to be at?
It will largely depend, I think, on the tests, because accountability is the big concept these days. And this is what is driving the fears of a lot of teachers and administrators, because they too are going to be on the hook. So the more you stay the particular course you have, you're going to face problems that we can't even envision at this point. As there's a whole aspect to Common Core, not the standards, but the data collection aspect of it that people are becoming very concerned about, and you will hear other people address that. There are other issues to this centralization of schooling in this country that have yet to be played out. We don't know what the tests are going to be like. We don't know where the cut score is going to be. What are the consequences for schools and teachers? Teacher unions now are becoming at the local level in many states, because I'm now on panels with the union person who is often agreeing with me because they're hearing from the teachers in their own building and can privately say that they are very concerned about what accountability is going to do for teachers if the student scores on these tests play a huge role, and they don't even know who's vetted these test items. This is part of the problem that the mathematicians are now having. So it's still a work in progress, and that's why it's hard to give you a definitive answer, because every day there are new directives, pronouncements. I know in Massachusetts that many superintendents, local superintendents, several months ago converged on the State House to tell the state legislators, tell the Department of Ed to halt for a while. We can only take so many directives at a time. We can only do so much at a time. Classrooms, many teachers are in a flux of, there's a state of chaos in many teachers and in many schools, because it's not clear whether all classes teaching subject X, all the different sections of a class, should be teaching the same thing. How do you make sure that you have exactly the same expectation across, say, all sections of an Algebra 1 class, if they're not all on the same page as in France, the famous example with dictations? So there are just a lot of things that are still being worked out. And where to go, what superintendents could do, I just think that removing a lot of the paperwork at both the state and the federal level, which has been increasing since 1960, would be one step forward. We have a revolving door in this country, statistically, of superintendents every 2.5 years. And teacher turnover in many middle schools is like every 3 to 4 years, the entire staff. I began to see this when I was on the Board of Ed. We would look at teacher turnover in our low-performing schools. Teachers don't want to teach in a low-performing school if there's a stigma or a label attached to it. But this was psychological, and no one at that time in the department even knew that the label of the school as a low-performing school was preventing the superintendent from getting new and good teachers to come into that school. The label itself has a problem, an aura attached to it, which we hadn't heard about from superintendents until it finally occurred. This was why they were having a problem recruiting. But there's another piece, and this is the USDE saying that it wants to redistribute effective teachers. I don't know how many of you have thought about the implications of that. But this is now something that is in one of some documents that are on the USDE's website. What does it mean to say that you want to redistribute your effective teachers in a school system across states? Can you order people to go teach elsewhere as they, once did, say, in the Soviet Union? You would be told to go and teach in a school in Siberia for 5 years. I'm just trying to give you a sort of semi-facetious example to get a sense of we don't know where all this is going. New things keep coming out all the time from the idea that all this data will be available centrally, and that there's an attempt to determine who is this effective teacher and how do we make sure that we have effective teachers in all of our schools. Is this a decision to be made in Washington, D.C. or Wisconsin? Should it be made in Madison? Should it be made in a local community? Is it the kind of decision that should be made at all? I don't know.